Hey, what's up? It's Jared with Gear and Light. Today, we're gonna learn how to take better photos with your camera immediately. That's right, by the time that you get to the end of this video, you're gonna be taking better photos with your camera. Now, this is geared towards beginners or people who haven't been utilizing manual mode on their cameras. I'm gonna go through this pretty quickly, but I also have a free course called Ditch Auto, Start Shooting in Manual Mode that goes into everything a lot deeper. So if I blow through things a little too fast here, you can definitely check out that course. I've got it linked down in the description below, and it is a free course. So we're gonna understand three main concepts of our camera here and what they do, and I'm gonna talk about how I utilize those settings when I'm out shooting in the field. So we have our shutter speed, our aperture, and our ISO or ISO. Those three settings control different things on the camera to allow light to do different things as it comes in the camera and the sensor captures it. So we're gonna talk about my mindset as I kind of go through utilizing my camera. These three settings are easily accessible on your camera. If you have a Sony camera like me, your aperture is going to be up front, and on most cameras, this is where the aperture adjustment is. So going left to right, you can adjust your aperture. Most cameras also have the shutter speed adjustment on the back of the camera towards the top. If you're utilizing a smaller camera like an APS-C camera or a crop sensor camera, sometimes that adjustment is actually the wheel that you rotate on the back. You have your aperture here and the wheel on the back. I know that's the case with my smaller cameras. On this particular camera, you also have the ISO adjustment on the back here as well. And by default, you tap to the right, and then you can adjust your ISO. On a lot of cameras, you also may have an ISO button that you hold, and then that turns the rocker into the ISO adjustment, or the rotating switch into the ISO adjustment as well. So you'll want to identify where these settings are on your camera and get comfortable with using them. You're not going to be able to utilize these settings unless you are in manual mode. There are other modes that are semi-manual on your camera, but the only way to adjust all three of these settings is to be in the full manual mode on your camera. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the shutter speed. The shutter speed is how long the sensor is exposed to light when you press down that shutter button. So when you press down the shutter button, the shutter opens and closes at a specific speed, and that is called your shutter speed. The slow shutter speed is a lower number, and it is represented like a fraction on your camera. You might see 1/200 for 1/200th of a second, or you might see 1/60th for 1/60th of a second. That is your shutter speed. The lower the number, the slower the shutter speed, which means that opens and closes slower, letting in more light. But the longer that it's opened, the more stuff can happen in front of your camera, and that can introduce some motion blur and make for a blurry photo. So if you've ever shot a photo in automatic mode on your camera in a low light situation, a lot of times that shutter speed gets super low, and then you end up getting a blurry photo because of it. And in manual mode, we're able to tell the camera where to put that shutter speed, so we don't go too low on the shutter speed and get motion blur, but we don't go so high on the shutter speed that we're not getting enough light into our camera. So shutter speed controls that, and slow shutter speed is for letting more light into the camera. A higher shutter speed is for letting less light into the camera, but also a fast shutter speed freezes that action. So when the shutter opens and closes really fast, it freezes that action. So when you're shooting sports or fast-moving subjects, sometimes you want to go up to a higher shutter speed so you can freeze that action. Fast-moving things with a lower shutter speed are going to be blurry, and that may have happened to you in the past in your photos, but setting a higher, faster shutter speed means that it's going to freeze that action. Now, there are more advanced methods to camera movement and slower shutter speeds to getting really neat effects, but just know that if your subject is moving or you're moving things around a lot, a higher shutter speed is going to help you freeze that action. A lower shutter speed is going to help you see better in darker situations. And in those lower shutter speed situations, you may even need a tripod depending on your camera. Cameras like this with internal stabilization do a better job of helping you out in those slower shutter speeds, but cameras that don't have them may need to be locked down on a tripod, because any movement that you make to the camera is also introducing movement into your photo, and then that can introduce blur as well. So I think of the shutter speed first because I know when I'm looking at what I'm going to capture, how much of that needs to be captured and at what shutter speed. Because if it's a fast moving object, I know I need a higher shutter speed and I need to make the other settings work to capture that photo. I know that if nothing is moving and I can put my camera on a tripod, I can get that shutter speed really slow if I need that extra light. So when I look at a scene, if I'm out in a bright day, I might go with a higher shutter speed. If I'm in a darker situation, I might go with a lower shutter speed. And if it's dark enough, I may even use a tripod to help stabilize my shot even more. The next thing we're going to look at is our aperture. Aperture is the second thing I go to because aperture controls the look and feel of the photo more than any of the other settings in my opinion. Now, when you look into your camera and you see those blades in there, those blades that open and close, that is the aperture. And with film cameras, it's actually called the iris. And so with that aperture, the wider the aperture, the more light that comes in. That makes sense, right? You open a bigger window, more light comes in. A smaller window, less light. So when you close down that aperture, less light is coming through. So this is an interesting way to control light that gets to your sensor. So whether you're using a high or a slow shutter speed, fast or slow, you can control the amount of light that gets to your shutter. Now the challenge there is that it changes the look and feel of your photo. A photo with a really wide aperture is going to have a shallow depth of field. And what that means is that when you are looking at your subject in the photo, your subject may be in focus, but everything, the fall off behind them gets blurry really fast. A shallow depth of field means a shallow area of focus. Now, when you close down that aperture and get a smaller aperture, it actually extends that depth of field and gives you a deeper area of focus. This can be useful for different types of photos. If I was taking a photo portrait of someone, just a single person, and they're looking pretty straight onto the camera, I may use a shallower depth of field to give a nice smooth fall off of the image behind them, making the attention draw towards the subject. But if I have a group of people that are kind of standing at different distances, but all relatively close, like a group photo, I can't shoot with a shallow depth of field because my people in the second row, or maybe even if someone is just a few inches behind the other person, they're going to be out of focus, and that's not a good look for a group photo. So you want a smaller aperture for that so that you get a deeper depth of field. But as you change your aperture, you may also need to change your shutter speed. The reason that I mentioned shutter speed first is because if I'm taking a family portrait and I have a couple of squirrely kids in there, I can't have a slow shutter speed. A slow shutter speed means that those squirrely kids are going to be blurry, and I want to make sure that everybody's nice and sharp. So I may need to set my shutter speed at 1/200th of a second to make sure I freeze all the action that's happening in that photo. But because it's a group photo, I may need a smaller aperture. So I may need to tighten down my aperture a little bit to f6 or something around that range to make sure I have appropriate depth of field. I can't go wide open at, like this lens is an f1.8. I can't go f1.8 and take a group portrait. So in these two instances, I have 1/200th of a second, which is a little bit faster of a shutter speed, which means less light. I also had to stop down on my lens and go with a smaller aperture, which means less light. So that takes us to ISO, which is our third and final setting on the camera, which is the sensitivity of the sensor. Now, when there isn't as much light available to the sensor, you can increase its sensitivity, which allows it to see better in darker situations. The problem with increasing our ISO is that the more sensitive you make the sensor, the more noisy your image can get. And depending on the camera that you have, if you have especially an older camera, it can introduce a lot of noise into that image. So as we play with the sensitivity, I only like to use the ISO as a boost. So if I have my settings pretty close, that 1/200th of a second, or maybe people are holding more still, I can go down to 1/160th of a second, and I have my aperture set where I wanted, maybe like an f4, but it's still not a super bright day, so I need a little bit more to get my exposure there. I can increase my ISO a little bit, and that increases the sensitivity of the sensor, allowing the sensor to bring in more light. I just want to make sure not to go too high. In those extreme low light situations where you have to have some settings that aren't letting in a ton of light and you have to boost your ISO quite high in order to get an exposed shot, you may end up having a little bit of noise in your image. But you can always take it into Adobe Lightroom and apply a little bit of noise reduction to bring back some of that. It does smoothen things quite a bit, so it takes away from the sharpness of your image, but it still looks good and the applications do a good job of removing noise. So ISO is great because it boosts the sensitivity of the sensor, allowing you to have more flexibility with the other two settings. Back in the day when I first started in digital photography, the ISO sensitivity could not go very high without ruining your image. That meant in lower light situations, I had to slow down my shutter speed quite a bit, and I had to open up my aperture as wide as I can get it. And in a lot of those situations, I still ended up with blurry images unless I used an external flash. Using an external flash allowed me to increase my shutter speed and make it faster because I was introducing extra light into my scene. But all of that adds complexity and is definitely a little bit more advanced when you start introducing flash and controlling all of that along with manual settings. So just to recap, the shutter speed is what I set first because based on what I want to capture, I want to make sure it's sharp. I want to make sure that I capture it and it's not blurry. I then set my aperture because the aperture is going to affect the overall look and feel of the image the most. So of course I want it sharp, but I also want the look and feel that I'm going for. So if it's a portrait or a subject and I want a shallow depth of field, I can set that wide aperture. Otherwise, I stop down a little bit in order to get a little bit more depth into my image. And then I use the ISO to give myself some more wiggle room where needed, because the ISO is not going to affect your image until you get a high enough ISO where the sensor starts to fall apart a little bit and produce some noise into your image. So ISO is always where I go last because it's kind of the boost in my camera that gives me a little bit of extra wiggle room. On all cameras, there is an exposure meter, and you can use that exposure meter to get your scene overall correctly exposed. I use it as a guideline, and I use my eye to tell the rest of the story. On mirrorless cameras, you see exactly what you're going to get by looking through the viewfinder or the back screen. If you're on a DSLR camera, if you go into live view mode and look on the back screen, it's going to give you a preview of what you can expect with that photo. But otherwise, if you're just looking through the eyepiece on a regular DSLR, you need to understand your settings and what it's going to take so that you're not just taking sample shots, changing settings, sample shot, changing settings, and before you know it, you've got 30 shots taken before you've got a properly exposed image. The more you understand your camera settings and how that actually produces an image, the more you're going to be able to walk into a scene, look around, know what you're trying to capture, what look you're going for, and then what kind of additional adjustment you need using ISO to boost if you need it. So quickly, I wanted to mention my website, learnwithjared.com. It's the website where that Ditch Auto course that I talked about is at. I also have other courses on productivity, such as the Organize Your Life with Notion productivity course for you to check out, and then also some free courses on Lightroom editing as well for your photo editing. So let's talk about looking at your scene and being able to capture a great image from the get-go. When you arrive and you're composing your scene in your mind, you want to think about what's moving and what action needs to be frozen. That way you can set your shutter speed appropriately. I usually start out around 1/120th, 1/160th of a second, especially if things are moving. If things are moving fast, I increase that. If things are not moving really at all and I need some more light, I can go with a lower shutter speed. I then look at my aperture and decide in my shot, what do I want in focus? Do I want to isolate something and make something more prevalent in the shot while everything else is kind of blurry? I know that I want to go with a wider aperture. If I want more of a depth of field, I'll move that down a little bit and go with a higher aperture number, which is closing down the aperture. Some people will call it stopping down as more of an advanced term in photography. I then set my ISO. If it's bright outside, I know I can use a low ISO. If it's dark outside, I know I may need to boost that ISO up a little bit and go with a higher number. My desire is to keep that ISO as low as possible to prevent adding any degradation to the photo that wouldn't have happened otherwise. At times, I may jump back and make little adjustments in my camera to those other settings as needed. If I know I'm going to have to boost my ISO up quite a bit to get that exposure and I don't want to have to do that, I'll then go to my shutter speed and slow that down a little bit, and I'll also open up my aperture if need be. And if I still can't get there, I'll put on a lens that has a much wider aperture that lets a lot more light in, or I'll add light to my scene as needed. Practice makes perfect. You need to get out there and shoot with your camera. We can talk about settings, we can talk about how to use them, but getting out there, putting it in manual mode, and practicing by shooting photos of different things, whether it's people, places, things, go travel, go on a hike and just shoot some photos. The more that you practice, the faster you're going to get at this process, and you'll get to the point where you can walk into any situation, get your settings right in a second or two, and get great photos without even having to think about it too much. That is what a full understanding of manual photography is, and it is something you can achieve with a little bit of practice. My last invitation to you is to join our Ditch Auto Facebook group. There's over 4,000, I think 5,000 photographers in there, sharing photos, tips, tricks, helping each other out to become better photographers by giving each other feedback and just being a general support system for each other as we are photographers making decisions, wanting to learn new things. There's people from all over the world. It is one of the best communities I've ever been a part of. Make sure to check that out. It is linked below. But that's going to do it for this video. I hope that it helped you out in better understanding your camera so that you can get out there and capture much better images immediately. Start thinking in that three-part mindset as I outlined in this video, and you're going to get better photos. I guarantee it. But that's going to do it for today. I hope that you enjoyed the video. Subscribe to the channel if you want to see more like this. Give this video a thumbs up if it was a help. I know that there's a lot more to photography than what I just mentioned, but that is going to get you there, get you as close as possible. Practice is going to take you even further. But until next time, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.